On this Sunday night, breaking news, a Snowbird plane crashes in BC.
No way!
The tragedy for Canada's military.
You see that plane just coming out of the sky?
What witnesses saw as the plane went down in a residential neighborhood. Are Canadians ready to venture out into this brave new world as the reopening begins? Plus, plenty of lobsters, but a shortage of labor.
Global National with Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin with breaking news out of British Columbia tonight, where a Snowbird jet belonging to the Canadian military has crashed. Global News can confirm that one member of the team is dead, another ejected from the cockpit, landed on a house, and is in stable condition in hospital.
Holy f***! What the?
This video, captured by witnesses, shows two planes were in unison, then one started to climb, gaining altitude before spiraling to the ground. The plane went down in a residential neighborhood in Kamloops, BC.
When they took off, the one kind of deviated and went off by itself. It looked like they were just going to have some fun or whatever, put on a show. And once, as it started going upside down, angled over, I heard the guy in the truck beside me. He goes, "No, they're serious." And then you could see the pilots ejecting, and it didn't look like they were very high off the ground when they finally got out of that plane.
Let's bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, you've learned the identity of the person who was killed.
Yeah, Robin, I'm sorry to report it is Captain Jennifer Casey. She was the public affairs officer for the Snowbirds team. I can tell you she's someone we dealt with an awful lot as media, just a fantastic woman. She was a former broadcaster herself. She joined the military, became an officer, and she was traveling with the Snowbirds, as the public affairs officers do. It's their job to do all the media and community relations for the team. She was on board that plane that went down. Her family has been notified of this tragedy. Again, the victim in this crash is Captain Jennifer Casey, the Snowbirds public affairs officer. The male pilot who was flying the plane, who we are not identifying at this point, survived. He was injured. He was transported to hospital where he is stable. He ended up landing on a roof. They did not have a lot of time to eject from the plane. It was quite low. You see it pull up very quickly after takeoff where it appears to lose thrust for some reason. I've spoken to a number of pilots who see the maneuver you see happening there is one that is executed when a pilot is trying to gain altitude because they've lost airspeed. Gives them more time to potentially eject or to try to land the plane. And in this case, we do know that the pilot ejected. So we don't know the cause of this yet. We don't know the reason this happened, but obviously a terrible tragedy for the military and for the Air Force. This is the second death that they have had in just a couple of weeks. Of course, the cyclone known as the Stalker went down in the Ionian Sea on April 29th.
Mercedes, we know that this was a cross-country tour to promote inspiration and inspire Canadians because of the COVID-19 crisis, but there have been concerns about the safety of these planes for years. Given their age and previous crashes, were any concerns raised at any point during Operation Inspiration?
I don't know about during this particular operation, Robin, but there have been ongoing concerns from the crews over the years and from members of the Canadian Forces about the age of these planes. They're actually built in the 1960s, to give you an idea of how old they are. There have been numerous crashes before. 7 pilots have died in crashes in the past. The most recent crash was in October of 2019. The pilot survived that one by ejecting, but there are questions about the ejection seat and the engine. Now, the report on what happened in that crash has not yet been completed, so we don't know. And of course, it's important to say we don't know what the cause of today's crash was.
Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. Thanks, Mercedes. In other news, almost a dozen firefighters in Los Angeles are recovering tonight after being hurt in an explosion. The blast created a fireball so intense it melted the firefighters' coats, helmets, and scorched a fire truck across the street. As Jennifer Johnson explains, more than 200 firefighters had to be called out to get this fire under control.
Downtown Los Angeles filled with smoke after a one-story building fire created a massive fireball that shot into the air and street. Witnesses thought they heard multiple explosions.
It felt like it was a series. Like there was definitely one main one, but it felt like as it kept going, there were more.
First responders described the boom as a freight train or jet engine shaking the block.
Now they're inside this building where the smoke is active.
It was a worst-case scenario for firefighters. The business was a supplier of butane honey oil used in making concentrated cannabis. Fortunately, the lead officer quickly detected danger.
The smoke pressure was escalating. The heat was increasing in the rear of the occupancy. He directed everybody to immediately get out of the building.
That order saved their lives. In a flash, while they made their way out, an explosion erupted from the building. First responders sent out a mayday call. The blaze was so intense, witnesses saw firefighters coming down the aerial ladder from the roof with their protective coats and helmets on fire.
This could have been horrendous. All of the firefighters that came in were awake and alert and talking when they came in, which is a great sign.
Fortunately, the area was not filled with people, as Los Angeles remains mostly locked down due to COVID-19. The injured firefighters are expected to be okay.
Good news is everybody's going to make it. Got a lot of firefighters that are shaken up.
The cause of the blaze is still unclear. LA's fire chief knows this could have been a deadly call for his firefighters in a city that has already been on edge for months. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Now to the other big story, the COVID-19 crisis in Canada. Here's a look at the breakdown of cases. Close to 77,000 people have contracted COVID-19 in this country. Tonight, there are still more than 32,000 active cases of COVID-19. The good news is that more than half of the patients have recovered from the virus. Quebec is the hardest hit province. It recorded more than 700 new cases today, and 79 more people died in just 24 hours. More businesses are set to reopen next week, but it will look very different from what we're used to. Restaurants and retail services in BC are preparing to welcome customers back with plexiglass installed at dining tables and at checkout counters. There will be regular deep cleaning, and staff will be donning masks as they serve patrons. While many Canadians are itching for more freedom, will they be willing to step out and resume regular activities? As Mike Drolet reports, it depends on what those activities are.
Call it testing the waters. All across the country, Canadians are dipping their toes in freedoms we've taken for granted. Toronto closed many of its streets in the name of biking and fresh air, while golfers took to the links.
I've been itching.
In record numbers.
We sold out within minutes of opening our online booking.
It speaks to how long we've been living in isolation. In a new poll conducted by Ipsos on behalf of Global News, the results are clear. Canadians want out. It's no surprise as Calgary Mall had a lineup when it opened, because that's where 63% of Canadians said they'd like to go. And Edmonton patios were clearly humming for a reason. 60% say they can't wait to go to a restaurant.
It's been a long time. We certainly needed it, that's for sure.
But the polling also shows Canadians haven't forgotten the reason we've been in isolation so long.
I'm not one of the people who think that we should open up quite yet.
COVID-19 is still a very real threat, which is why only 32% say they'd stay in a hotel and 18% would go to a sporting event. In what could be a preview of NHL, NBA, and baseball games in North America, the German Bundesliga kicked off with nary a fan in the stands, although the supporters of one team made 12,000 cutouts of themselves to make the players feel less alone. And when Danish singer Mads Langer performed at a drive-in, he showed the summer may not be completely lost when it comes to concerts, especially when considering 22% of Canadians feel comfortable going to live shows right now.
How many people are going to want to go to a show where they could come into close proximity with sweaty strangers who may be infected? That's the bigger problem.
Toronto band July Talk has a couple of drive-in shows planned for August, and other bands are planning similar shows in BC.
Frankly, it's better than nothing. I mean, it's great to be able to see these virtual shows using Skype and Zoom and YouTube and Instagram and all the rest of it, but there's nothing that can really replace the atmosphere of a live performance with you actually being there with other like-minded people.
And the sad truth is it could be a year or longer before concerts and arenas start looking normal again, so we might as well get used to it. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Lobster season is officially underway in the Maritimes. It was delayed by 2 weeks because of COVID-19. But seafood processors in New Brunswick say they will struggle to stay afloat because of a labor shortage. The province has banned temporary foreign workers who would normally help during the fishing season. And as Ross Lord reports, Canada's billion-dollar lobster industry fears the losses could be enormous.
At lobster processing plants in New Brunswick, up to half the seasonal workforce is typically recruited from countries like Mexico and Jamaica. With New Brunswick's COVID-19 measures banning temporary foreign workers, plants are half empty. Desperate plant managers are turning to teenagers whose classes have been canceled by the pandemic.
Now, my son's 13 and he came to work 2 weeks ago. And now a lot of his friends came and the word got around.
They say they're still short-handed. Now that the season in southeast New Brunswick is underway, fishers can only sell half as much lobster as they'd like because that's all the plants can convert into retail products. Processors suggest Premier Blaine Higgs' foreign worker ban is making a tough time for the lobster industry even worse.
He was thinking he was protecting the citizens, and he thought that there'd be enough New Brunswickers that would be willing to come to work. And that's where he was mistaken.
Premier Higgs admits he's disappointed.
You know, I think it's a sad commentary on our province if we have 70,000 people unemployed and that basically we're not able to find enough people to work in the opportunities that exist. It tells us something about our challenges we have as a province, maybe as a nation.
The federal government has announced up to $500 million in support to fish harvesters, but New Brunswick plants doubt that help will arrive in time. They say some product will end up going to other provinces that still hire temporary foreign workers. Ross Lord, Global News, Windsor, Nova Scotia.
America's biggest cities have seen large numbers of people being infected by this pernicious virus. One of the hardest hit populations is the Navajo Nation. They span across 3 states and have more than 3,100 cases, the highest per capita rate of coronavirus infection anywhere in the U.S. Reggie Cecchini reports.
Lost in the spotlight of the seemingly endless outbreaks in urban areas, a deadly battle is underway deep in the desert.
We got to stay vigilant.
America's Navajo Nation, one of the oldest indigenous reservations in the country, is sinking under the weight of the virus.
Tribal nations, the first citizens, are put on the bottom of the list, it seems to us.
We spoke to the nation's president, Jonathan Nez, in April when there were 698 positive cases. Today, the infection rate per capita is now the highest in America. Covering just over 77,000 square kilometers over 3 states, Navajo Nation has a population of 175,000 and is roughly the size of New Brunswick.
We just want everybody to recognize that tribal communities are in need of assistance as well.
Studies have shown people of color are at a heightened risk of contracting this virus. Navajo residents suffer from high rates of diabetes and hypertension, but money and access to care is limited. Federal funding to reservations is often slow to move. Infrastructure is poor. The region is a food desert, meaning residents drive to larger cities, putting themselves at risk. At home, basic mitigation efforts like hand washing are often impossible.
30% of the homes on Navajo Nation don't have running water. So how are they going to do that?
In a rare move, Doctors Without Borders has been dispatched on American soil, telling Global News in a statement their team is providing training on infection prevention and control, adding they will help expand contact tracing. Their presence in the U.S. is a first. The organization typically assists in war-ravaged and low-income nations. A $2 trillion stimulus package approved in March will provide more than $500 million in aid to the Navajo. But local leaders say it's too little and far too late.
Tribal nations have contributed a lot to this country. And we're just saying that we want our share of resources.
COVID-19 adding yet another challenge in the ongoing struggle to maintain independence and equality across American reservations. Reggie Cecchini, Global News, Washington.
Brazil's president has been slammed for not taking the pandemic seriously. That country has 233,000 cases of COVID-19, the fourth highest number of cases in the world. Other Latin American countries that are locked down are also struggling. Peru took action early, shutting down borders in March and even limiting which days people could leave their homes. It now has more than 80,000 COVID-19 cases, and there's particular concern about the spread of the coronavirus in markets. At one produce market in the capital, 79% of vendors have tested positive for the illness. And then there's El Salvador. It enacted some of the toughest COVID-19 restrictions even before it had a single case. It now has about 1,300. Human rights groups have accused the president of abusing power amid the pandemic. More than 7,000 people have been detained in cramped containment centers after returning to the country or for violating quarantine measures. It's feared the virus is spreading among the detainees, but the government isn't revealing how many of them have tested positive or how many have died. Coming up, between an activist and a former president, their messages to the class of 2020. Normally, this time of year is filled with graduation events. Instead, the class of 2020 is taking part in a virtual graduation.
Tonight, we honor 12 years of your hard work.
This special, called Graduate Together, America Honors the High School Class of 2020, was hosted by NBA star LeBron James. A number of musicians, actors, and activists came together last night to celebrate grads, including Malala Yousafzai.
The class of 2020 won't be defined by what we lost to this virus, but by how we responded to it. The world is yours now.
Former U.S. President Barack Obama had the final remarks of the night. In his speech, he called on graduates to shape the future. He also took a dig at his successor.
You know, all those adults that used to think were in charge and knew what they were doing, turns out they don't have all the answers. Do what you think is right. Doing what feels good, what's convenient, what's easy, that's how little kids think. Unfortunately, a lot of so-called grown-ups, including some with fancy titles and important jobs, still think that way, which is why things are so screwed up.
Still ahead, we continue our coverage of the Snowbirds crash in BC. What more we're learning about this tragedy for the Canadian military. Returning to our top story, a Canadian Snowbird plane, which was part of a military flyover across Canada, has crashed in BC. It happened in Kamloops, a city located in the interior of the province. This is the shocking and dramatic footage caught by witnesses on the ground. It appears the two jets were in unison, then one turned and started to climb, gaining altitude before spiraling to the ground. It went down in a residential neighborhood and hit a house. Our Mercedes Stephenson has been talking to her military sources, and we now have an identity of the person who was killed.
Yeah, Robin, very sad to report that it's Captain Jennifer Casey. She was the public affairs officer for the unit. Those of us in the media dealt with her a lot, and she was a respected journalist before she joined the military to serve her country. Doubling down on this tragedy of it not only being the second major air accident within just over 2 weeks for the Canadian Air Force. On top of that, Captain Casey was from Nova Scotia, a province that has already suffered so much grief in the past month.
Were there any concerns about the safety of these planes given previous crashes and the age of these planes?
It's certainly something that's been raised a number of times. There's concern about them because they were built in the 1960s. And to be clear here, Robin, these are really incredibly skilled pilots. I mean, they are the air show team and incredibly skilled maintainers who keep these in the air. But they are planes that were built in the 1960s, and there have been concerns about both the engines and the ejection seats in the past. We don't know what caused this crash. It could have been anything from an engine failure to a bird strike. All we know is that it happened, and we're still trying to figure out what. I can tell you, by the way, Robin, that right now there is a flight safety investigation team from the Canadian Forces on their way to BC.
Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. And Global National will be back after this short break.
You're watching Global National.
Around the world, millions are turning to faith for answers in this difficult time, but the way they pray has changed because many places are either closed or have limited numbers. But as Redmond Shannon reports, the pandemic hasn't stopped them from finding new ways to practice what they preach and to pay it forward.
The kitchen at this Sikh temple in Surrey, BC has been home to a key ingredient of worship since the start of the pandemic: volunteering.
So people send the request for the groceries, for the food, and a request comes here.
Some of these volunteers are here partly because they're out of work themselves. Now they're delivering tens of thousands of meals to the isolated and to frontline workers. A new way to exercise their faith in a gurdwara that can only accept 50 worshippers a day.
We feel actually very happy in this time. At least we help the peoples. We help to each other. We have to take care each other. So I feel proud.
Technology has truly been a godsend for those who are isolating. Watching online is the next best thing to gathering at a temple, a mosque, or a church.
This ancient church in London was at the epicentre of the city's Great Plague of 1665, one that killed 20% of the city's population.
Reverend Canon Alison Joyce is inspired by her predecessor from that time, Richard Pearson.
Many clergy fled the city. Richard Pearson, who was vicar here at St Bride's during that time, was one of very, very few who actually chose to remain.
His bravery informs Canon Joyce's Sunday sermons, the audio broadcast around the world from this empty church.
We found our congregation is actually growing remarkably, and it's also reaching people internationally, which we hadn't expected. And I think we're not alone in that.
Canon Joyce says when worshippers return, some difficult decisions need to be made, particularly when it comes to administering Holy Communion.
We're learning to do ministry in a completely different way, and we're learning lessons that, like many churches, we'll take forward into the future as well.
This universal struggle is testing how people worship, but not the depth of their faith. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And that is Global National for this Sunday. I'm Robin Gill. Tomorrow I'll be reporting from Kamloops, BC on that tragic Snowbirds crash. Donna Friesen will be at the anchor desk. Thank you for joining us. Good night.